In this video, I'm going to walk you through the rest of the PowerPoint from Chapter 9. Once we get a muscle to contract, it's going to generate a pulling force. Sometimes we want that pulling force to bend the joint, right? Like to flex my elbow. So if I have to pick something up, if I'm going to take a bite out of a burrito, I want to bend my elbows, right, to bring the burrito up towards my mouth. There are other times where I want to generate contraction force, but I don't want it to move. Or I'm generating some contraction, but I'm setting the burrito down, lengthening the muscle as it's contracting. These terms here all refer to those different ways of generating contraction. Isometric. Iso means the same. Metric, like a measure of length. So isometric means the same length. So there's no change in the muscle length, but tension increases. You can think of a bodybuilder, right? Or a little kid flexing his muscles to show how big his biceps are, right? You're going to contract that muscle to make it stand up, but there's not really any movement. Likewise, in posture, your muscles in your back and in your abdomen and in your legs are in a state of contraction to keep you in a standing position, even though you might be otherwise perfectly still. It's an isometric contraction. Isotonic means we have roughly the same muscle tone, but we're going to be changing the length. The muscle is either going to be shortening as it generates force or lengthening as it generates force. So I have a cup of coffee here. If I want to take a drink, I have to generate force and shorten the muscle. That's the concentric, as I bring the cup up towards my mouth. And then when I want to set the cup down, I can't just relax the muscle, or I might smash the cup on the table. So I have to generate force, but slowly lengthen the muscle in order to gently set something down. That's an example of eccentric. Eccentric, concentric. These are isotonic contractions. And then isometric, as we said, means the same length. When we use the phrase muscle tone, we're really talking about this sort of low-grade constant tension that we can generate for long periods of time. For example, if you rest your arm on the table, you might think that your arm is really relaxed, but actually at any given moment, a small percentage of your muscle fibers are in a state of contraction. They're sort of rotating through. We come back to this idea here that a muscle fascicle is a combination of individual muscle fibers, right? We might see that this neuron goes to this specific fascicle, but this other neuron goes to this fascicle. So we could number them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And at any given time within a muscle belly, a small number of these cells are twitching or contracting to generate what we call resting muscle tone. So if we could slow it down, it might look like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. They're sort of each taking their own turn. And then when I want to generate more force to do movement or for an isometric contraction, just to hold tension, then I might turn on several of these at the same time. Or for a maximal contraction where I'm really lifting, I might be firing all of them at the same time. If you are curious about that and you want to learn more, you could go on YouTube and do a search for MS fasciculations or ALS fasciculations. What you'll see is an abnormal firing pattern, so you can actually see the individual motor units firing. Okay, going back to this idea of different kinds of contraction and how we hold that. It all comes down to the fact that we have to generate sufficient ATP. Remember that ATP is this universal chemical energy source within our bodies made by the mitochondria. We have to have both oxygen and fuel in order to harvest the energy from the fuel. By fuel, I mean food. I mean nutrients, right? If I hold my breath, I'll run out of oxygen quite quickly, and I'll probably pass out. But I can go a long period without eating and still generate lots of ATP. And that's because our body has the ability to store up energy, storing up fat, and storing up muscle starch. So, in the case where I have enough oxygen and I have fuel stored up in my body or fuel in my bloodstream from something that I've just eaten, I can use this one here, aerobic respiration, using oxygen to break down these chemicals like blood sugar to produce ATP. Now remember, it also generates carbon dioxide and water as the byproducts of that chemistry. And so when I'm really exercising or doing a lot of work, I have to increase my respiratory rate to keep enough oxygen coming in to supply the energy that my muscles are demanding, and I have to be breathing a lot to get rid of the carbon dioxide in the water. There are times where we're working so hard that we can't keep up. Even if we're breathing heavily and even if our heart rate is up, we simply can't provide enough oxygen. And then our muscles begin to go into what we call anaerobic respiration. Anaerobic meaning without oxygen. This occurs in the absence of oxygen. So imagine if you're sprinting full speed one whole lap around the track. It's known as the 400 meter. It's just a brutal race because the last, say, 30 meters, you've really run out of oxygen. And in order to keep running at full speed, you have to start burning up this glucose in the absence of oxygen. And it yields this very painful chemical, lactic acid. This is why many athletes, after a sprint like that, vomit. Many people feel an intense burning pain in their lungs and in their blood vessels and in their muscles. And it's because we were designed to make ATP with oxygen. But in times where we have to run for our lives or run for our dinner or run for the gold medal, then we have to push beyond that level of oxygen and we start to generate lactic acid. Now there's an intermediate chemical called creatine phosphate that we can store up so that during extreme bursts of activity, we can also synthesize ATP. And this one doesn't require oxygen and it doesn't generate lactic acid, which is of course why many athletes use creatine phosphate as a supplement. Creatine phosphate is not a steroid. It doesn't make your muscles bigger, but it makes your workouts more intense, which makes your muscles bigger, right? The downside, of course, is that creatine phosphate is metabolized into creatinine, which is toxic and has to be gotten rid of through the kidneys. And so many a young athlete who knew just enough to be dangerous poisoned his or her kidneys by taking too much of this creatine phosphate. All right, let's take a look at a different way of thinking about this same process. Imagine this situation here. I have to run away from a lion. I'm walking out in the prairie and suddenly a predator, like a big lion or a wolf, starts to run after me, and I have to literally run for my life. The first thing that's going to happen is I'm going to use a lot of the oxygen that I've stored up in my muscle. We have oxygen in our bloodstream bound to a protein called hemoglobin. We have oxygen stored in our muscle too, bound to a protein called myoglobin. Right? Hemoglobin is in the blood. Myoglobin is in the muscle. And so there's tons of oxygen. And assuming that I've eaten something or that I have stored up some glucose in my muscle in the form of this muscle starch called glycogen, then I can quickly generate tons of ATP, right? Bam, I gotta run for my life. I don't have time to tell the animal, nice kitty, just let me have a little snack before I go. No, I have to have that glucose in the muscle already, and we do, stored in the muscle starch called glycogen. That gets quickly broken down into glucose and then pyruvic acid. And then, assuming that I have enough oxygen, I can run the citric acid cycle and I can generate all the ATP that I need. So for those first 10 or maybe 15 seconds that I'm sprinting away from this predator, I don't really have to breathe, and I certainly don't have to eat because I have both oxygen and fuel, and so I'm ready to go. Now the problem is, very quickly I run out of oxygen, and so then I have to start burning my glucose through, into pyruvic acid, just as we saw here with this first phase. But this time, without oxygen, I do fermentation. Anaerobic respiration is oftentimes called lactic acid fermentation. And look how many ATP we get out of it. 2 ATP per glucose molecule. Now, in the most extreme situations, I may be able to run for several minutes through a lot of pain, but if something is at my heels, my nervous system will block that pain. I'll get some endorphins and I can run for theoretically a few minutes on anaerobic respiration. But afterwards, the amount of lactic acid in my system, if I were able to get away from this beast, would be really, really painful. A lot of sweating and headache and vomiting and muscle pain, and I would be very, very sore for the next few days. And a lot of that has to do with this anaerobic respiration and the fact that it generates a toxin called lactic acid. Really quickly going back, under normal circumstances, I'm just walking around my house or I'm out in the garden. I don't have to go into this toxic form. I have enough oxygen and I can increase my respiratory rate to continue to make all of the ATP that I need. Here's the other thing, the creatine phosphate. This is sort of an intermediate and short-term energy storage. We can store up, a few seconds worth, a burst of energy here to generate some additional ATP. So all of these processes together help us to survive by sprinting, if we have to, for short periods of time. If we are running a longer race or we have to run for quite some distance, as long as we slow down our pace a little bit, we can shift back from anaerobic respiration to aerobic respiration, right? Imagine jogging for, an hour. You could do it. You could jog slowly, and as long as you were huffing and puffing as you went along, breathing heavily, you can continue to produce all the ATP that you need. Of course, with training, people can do this for days, and you might be aware of really extreme long-distance ultra marathons where people run some 100 miles, only taking very short breaks. And that's because instead of using this burst of power, like a power lifter would, or someone who's sprinting, or a linebacker sprinting and pushing, right? They're using these tremendous bursts of power. No, this ultra marathoner is going to take it nice and easy. He's not going to generate much lactic acid because he's going to breathe enough and run slowly enough that he can maintain all of that ATP. We have two different types of muscle fibers, two different types of skeletal muscle cells, slow twitch and fast twitch. Slow twitch, not surprisingly, contract more slowly. They have better blood supply and more mitochondria. And so look at this. This is actually dark meat. Sort of gross to think about anatomy and food in the same sentence, but I'm going to do it anyway. Think about a chicken. Dark meat in chicken, the thigh and the leg, for example, these are muscles that have to have a lot of oxygen storing capacity. They have to be very fatigue resistant. It's because chickens during the day are on their feet nonstop. They'll stop and lay down occasionally to preen or to rest, but most of the time they're up and looking for food. And so they don't want their legs to get tired out. So dark meat is fatigue resistant, and the reason it's dark is because of all of the blood vessels, the mitochondria, and a high percentage of this oxygen-binding protein, myoglobin. If a predator comes after a chicken, though, the chicken will fly up into the trees by using really powerful bursts of their breast muscles, right? Pectoralis major, The chicken breast is, of course, a sprinting muscle, right? They're sprinting in the air in order to sort of swim up through the air and up to the branch. And so this is white meat, right? It doesn't have as much mitochondria. It doesn't have as much of a blood supply. And these muscles respond really rapidly. So using creatine phosphate and the oxygen that they have stored in the muscle, they can generate a huge burst of power. But chicken can't fly to Florida, right? Because it has a sprinter. Interestingly, ducks and geese and birds who migrate long distances, they don't have white meat, right? Even their breasts are dark meat, and that's because they're long distance flyers. Okay, so now let's shift gears and think about our own bodies. Do we have certain muscles that are designed for quick bursts of power? Absolutely. Fast twitch muscles. Think about your blinking muscles, talking muscles, and really powerful muscles like the biceps. These are relatively fast twitch, and these ones can generate a lot of power. So you could do 10, maybe even 15 curls with a good 15-pound weight. But what would happen really quickly? Oh my gosh, it would get so tired. You could generate way more power just once, right? If you had to lift something off of your kid, or if you had to, in a performance, you had to try to lift 50 pounds, maybe you could do it, but just once. So the upper limbs of most people are fast twitch muscle because we can generate a lot of power, but they wear out really quickly. Slow twitch, these are postural muscles, right? So think about the back muscles and many of the muscles in our legs and our glutes. They have to allow us to walk around and to hold ourselves up against gravity. And so they have more mitochondria and they are fatigue resistant. Now we can change the relative proportion of fast twitch and slow twitch through exercise. And of course, we know that we can grow new muscle tissue, increasing the overall size of the muscle. This is called hypertrophy. So a football player ramping up for season, or a weightlifter really getting pumped up and ready for a big tournament or a show, whatever, a competition. They want to do a lot of hypertrophy, adding protein, adding muscle mass, and adding strength. The thing is, the increase in size isn't really due to the increase in muscle cells. You don't really grow new cells. Your cells just get bigger by adding new myofibrils. Increase in strength is due to a couple of different things, both changes in the brain that allow for a more coordinated contraction, as well as increase in metabolic enzymes like the creatine phosphate and enzymes that help within the mitochondria. You can actually increase the amount of mitochondria and circulation and less restriction by fat. Now, what would happen if our weightlifter right before the competition ended up having a terrible injury where he was intubated and then, paralyzed in the hospital? What we would see is over the next few weeks, a tremendous loss in muscle mass. We call this atrophy, and it happens much, much more quickly than most people think. As a matter of fact, if you are bedridden for a week and you really don't get out of bed, other than maybe to use the bathroom, you'll see significant loss in muscle mass, maybe 10, 15%. This process just continues, and so in cases of quadriplegia, depending on the nature of the spinal cord injury, we can see significant atrophy where the muscles just waste away. And it's the reverse of hypertrophy. In some cases, including muscular dystrophy, the muscle cells actually die. So here's a nice summary of all the things we just talked about. You should look through this. Don't study the table. Use it as a reference and put this information on flashcards, right? Make a summary. What is a type 1 and a type 2A and B? How are these different? Where do we find them in the body? Okay, getting towards the end, I want to talk really briefly about smooth muscle and cardiac muscle. Remember, um, the most significant difference between skeletal muscle and smooth and cardiac muscle is that these ones are involuntary, right? Skeletal muscle most of the time contracts only when I tell it to, when I will it to happen. I have this intention and what we call volitional movement. But smooth muscle and cardiac muscle are involuntary. Look at the way this muscle is structured. These actin and myosin fibers don't appear in a striated pattern. They're not all lined up like we had seen in skeletal muscle. Instead, they're sort of like a fishnet that can squeeze and twist. And because these cells are smaller and connected in a bit more of a twisting pattern, it allows these writhing and rolling movements. Most of the time, smooth muscle contracts because it's stimulated by the autonomic nervous system. This is sometimes thought of as the automatic nervous system or the involuntary organ and vessel controlling nervous system. So there are neurons that come down, very much like what we had seen in the neuromuscular junction, but oftentimes this electrical activity spreads from one cell to the other. Hormones as well can stimulate the movement of these organs. Cardiac muscle is also involuntary. It's found only in the heart. And the key things that you should know so far, although we're going to go into a lot of detail later on in the cardiac chapter, really the key here is what we had learned in histology. Striated, branching, and these connections, intercalated discs and gap junctions. These are physical attachments from one cell to the other, and these are electrical attachments from one cell to the other. Hey, congratulations, you've reached the end. Now go back and watch the videos in Blackboard. The animations that walk you through the neuromuscular junction, excitation, contraction, coupling, and the cross-bridge cycle.